Wonderful setup for what I hope to talk about today, which is really story emotional intelligence. So what you need to think about before you even begin to tell a story. So my background is I am a psychologist and have been since 1989 when I completed my doctorate. And it wasn't until 1997 or 98 that I began to discover story. And the irony is I think that most therapists, psychologists, their work is primarily the work of story, of listening to the stories of others, where they are stuck or uncomfortable, unsatisfied, unhappy in their stories, and how through that deep listening and the right level of response to help to disrupt that painful story and shift it so that they can move forward differently. With that understanding and intentionality around story and exploring of that, I began to move into executive coaching and working with leaders in their stories, not only their personal story, although that's often a focus, but the team story, the company story that we want to tell. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of an introduction of a case study, case story to frame what's about to come. I was invited by the CEO of a very large medical center to facilitate a 2-day leadership retreat. And his goal for this retreat was he wanted to set a new tone. He had concerns that retention was very low, particularly with nurses, that there was a culture of competition within the medical center. The various disciplines were siloed and people were competing for resources and budget as opposed to collaborating across. And in some ways, the focus of the patient had been lost in this. So he said, whatever you recommend as a way to get my top leadership team, which was over 100 executives from doctors down through the administrative staff, together in alignment to move forward in a different kind of way. And what we recommended was story from beginning to end, from top to bottom. So he at first was confused and I must admit somewhat apprehensive of story as a means of organizing this together. He was particularly apprehensive when we said we wanted to begin with him and how he starts the meeting, in that he always began the meeting with a PowerPoint presentation that usually lasted about an hour, which was sort of the state of the company. And we suggested that before he got to that PowerPoint, that he might want to begin with actually his story, the story of who he is, how he came to be in this position, what were the underlying values and beliefs that led him to be wanting to do this work, and how his personal mission and vision fit in with the larger mission and vision of the organization. He was extremely reluctant to be vulnerable in this way, to be transparent in this way. He thought nobody would be interested or care. But we did the background coaching work of what that story is. And he had an amazing story of within his family of origin, being the only child of 2 doctors, always assuming that he himself would be a doctor, trying to go to medical school, and after the first year dropping out, realizing this was not his path, being lost for several years until he got into hospital administration and realized that he loved the medical world, but not through the role of doctor, but through the role of administrator, business understanding, and that this was how he had married his passions together. And he had deep values and beliefs about the service that he wanted to provide in his life. So why would this be important? How would this be helpful? So I want to take a backward look at story. And I know if you've even been here since the beginning of the morning, you know so much of what I'm about to say, but to put it in that context here, hopefully will bring another understanding and deeper understanding for you. So story, any story is doing 4 things at once. That's part of its superpower. It's informing. There is a knowledge-based piece to it. That's the head. It's also inspiring, which is about the heart piece that David and Michael was talking about. And in that, it becomes a tool of influence. And lastly, what story does naturally is it entertains. And so many of the executives I work with say, I'm not in the entertaining business. I don't need to tell a story. The background is that story does this naturally by the way that it engages the brain. And Michael was talking about the cortisol and the oxytocin, that in fact, even when we move into storytelling mode, these neurochemicals are being released as we get into that flow of what story is. That sense of belonging and connectedness is happening even by the beginning of storytelling, of story connection. So if we think about what's going on in these, the inform is what's connecting to the head, the inspire is the hearts, the influence is how we move people through our story, the hands, to do something differently. This is the disruptive piece of change and how it happens. And the entertainment part is about how we are engaging the brain so that all these three things are actually happening and moving. As I think about leadership and what it is, and we were talking just in this last talk again with Michael about the essence of leadership is communication, which I break down into two parts. The first is presence, which is how you show up, how essentially you walk the talk, set the tone, role model what it is you want. And then influence is once you show up, what you actually do that inspires, that moves people to action. This understanding goes way back to the time actually of Aristotle, who talked about the tools of influence that we have in communication. He said that there are three: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, if you look at the roots of the word, ethics is very much in that. Ethos is about how we as leaders walk the talk, how we actually live the story, how our values in action are being lived through us in the story that we are creating. Pathos, if we think of the word empathy and the root of pathos in that, is about how we speak from our heart and touch the hearts of others so that we are inspiring them through our words. And lastly, logos, if we think of the word logic as being in the root of that, it's about the head, it's the words. And Aristotle himself would say the words are maybe 15 or 20% of influence. It's the ethos and the pathos that surround those words that create the greater influence in our communication. All of those things, again, are in story. If we think about the ethos, it's the influence, it's what we want someone to do, what we ourselves are doing. The pathos is the inspiration about how we're leading from our heart. And then the logos is the inform, how our head is driving the information, the knowledge that's needed for that. These, in essence, are the heart of emotional intelligence. So what does that look like in story realm? So storytelling is emotional intelligence in action. As the teller, it's about knowing myself. So who am I? And I'm going to go into each of these circles in more depth. So I'm just setting it up, the template now for this understanding. Knowing self is who am I? Who are they? Who is the listener? So it's about knowing other. And then the message is, how are we bringing me as the teller, you as the listener, through this message to a new place? In essence, this is the disruptive piece that Michael was talking about, because stories are indeed about change. And in the process of sharing this story between us, what will be different in terms of what we will then know, feel, and do? And whenever I'm working in a coaching situation with a client, this is the place I begin. Not what is the story, but what in who I am and who the audience is between the two of us. What do I want them to know at the end of my story, to feel at the end of my story, and to do at the end of my story? So it's through understanding ourselves and each other that leads to making the change, in fact, happen. So now I'm going to take us a little bit deeper into each of those areas and what is the work that we need to be doing before the story actually comes to life between us. So, if we were to create a metaphor around this and think of yourself when you are the storyteller or the speaker as the driver of a car, with the audience as your passenger, and the message is the destination where you want to bring them to that new, disruptive, different place. The story is the vehicle that allows those three things to come together to make that happen. So, to go deeply into each of those parts, knowing self, you as the driver. So, first of all, who are you? Why are you the person actually even telling this story or delivering this message? Is it your expertise in a particular area? Is it your level or role or responsibility? Is it a particular passion or your investment in outcome? Why are you the one even telling the story? The second is, how is this audience important to you? Why do you care that this audience receives this story? Why is this message important to you? And why do you want this audience to have this message? They seem simple on the outset, but when you start to really dig in deeply, all of these things will begin to inform the actual story itself and where it goes. Within that, looking at who you are, knowing self, what are the stories that you use to guide yourself? What are the stories that you often lead and tell others? And what does this reveal about the values that you hold, about what's important to you and why? And as we begin to formulate who you are, who this audience is, and the message, what are the underlying values within that that you hope to convey through this story? So, taking the deeper dive, we're always in the process of evolving our beliefs, our values, our passions and interests, our skills, abilities, behaviors, and actions, what I care about and why. And these are our values in action, and they're conveyed through our stories. So, to become first attuned to this part that is within you, this is the deeper part of knowing self as leader, as communicator, what is driving me underneath in this. So then focusing on your audience. Who are they to you? What's that level? Do they know you well? Is this, are you someone new to them? How do you begin with the context, knowing what they already know, both about you as well as about the message? To tune into what's the story they already hold about whatever message you're bringing. This again goes back to Michael's talk. If you're disrupting, you need to first really get clear in what's the story that the audience has already and how are they invested in that and invested in it not changing. So where is their resistance going to be to the message that you are about to bring them? And when you know that, you can already work that into the story that you are about to tell. So as those judgments are arising in them, they're already being answered by the story that you are creating and about to deliver. Always to think, so what do they expect me to say? What do they want me to say? And what do they need to hear from me that will lead them into that new place? Sometimes as leader, we are listener, and this is when we're flipping that upside down. So how do we as listener think about who that teller is, and how do we listen and elicit the stories that that teller actually might need to tell in order to know themselves better or to convey their message more clearly to us? This is going back to the work that Dan was doing around listening, about how do we create a container where we know self and what we're hoping to hear, but we also know other and where they are beginning and how we open and create a space between that we can be the elicitor of the story that they need to tell that will bring us both forward. Always in emotional intelligence, it's about knowing self, knowing other, whether you're in the role of speaker or listener, as a means of moving to a new and a better place. And what story is the one that will carry us there? So the there is, again, your destination. It's the message. It's the new idea. It's that disruptive idea. It's often that vision story that is not yet known to the listener. You as teller know the message. You as listener, if you've done your homework well, know the audience. Your job is to connect them to get that listener in your car and bring them to this new place with the understanding of, in this message, what you want them to know, which is the inform part, the information part, what has to happen in their head, that's the logos, what you want them to feel, because that is the connection of engaging the whole brain, the whole person, the whole influence of moving forward. And out of that, is there an ask, or is there a subtle shift of thinking that leads them to move into their new or next story differently from having heard this story? Because what we're always doing in storytelling is setting up the next story that we want to have happen, where we want things to, in fact, go. So the story of emotional intelligence is, what do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? And what do they need to know to do what you want them to do? There are as many vehicles as are appropriate for this teller with this audience with this message. It's not a one story fits all. And it may be that even the content of the story looks almost identical, but the manner in which it is delivered, where the emphasis is, can change dramatically the ride. So again, thinking of the metaphor, if you're trying to get your grandmother to another town versus your high school buddy versus your romantic partner, the destination may be the same, but the audience is different, so the vehicle has to shift as well. The story needs to be contained somewhat differently in order to meet this audience where they are and what they expect, what they want, and what they need to take them to this new place. So when all of those are in alignment, that automatically is a trust that's built between the teller and the listener, because they feel seen and known as you even begin. There is an evident passion between the teller and the message, and you're clear as the teller why this message is important, and that's conveyed to the listener such that they feel that as well. And ultimately what your work is creating the meaning between listener and that message that is as close to the meaning that you have as possible. One of the things that happens when we speak just in data rather than story is that the data comes in as facts and figures through the brain. And what the amygdala does is it immediately makes meaning out of that to determine whether I believe it or I don't, whether it's good or whether it's bad. It's that judgment piece that we were talking about earlier that happens no matter what. We are meaning-making animals, and it's part of our survival mechanism. So the more that you can have that data conveyed within a story that gives context and meaning to it, the closer that the audience is actually going to receive the message that you're trying to convey. So often we will speak in data that we have the meaning evolved in our own mind. We pass the data or facts along and we say, see, you get it? They say, yes, we do. But the image, vision, idea that actually they made into meaning in their own minds can look totally different. And that's where the misalignment, the disconnect can happen that leads us to think we're all moving forward in the same way. But in fact, we're carrying different stories. So the way towards alignment is to have everyone telling the same story. So it begins as we think about that leading by design rather than default, what we're doing is first getting clear in who am I and why am I here? What is my personal mission and the values that that stands on? And what is my vision of how I'm bringing myself forward into this? Who are you and who are you in that place? And then who are we together in that place of you and me together, whether it's the team or the larger organization? What is the larger mission vision that binds us? What's the story of that we want to tell? And then once we've built to that, how does it come back to what does that mean now that we have the information and the inspiration back to the hands? What do we need to do to get there? And how does that break down to then back to me again? What is my commitment of what I know, feel, and can do to get there? So it's a beginning with self, a moving to self and other to reach this larger place that comes back to who we are together, that comes back to who I am. And we're continually working through this circle as we're building new stories and moving forward together in this informed way. So in essence, it's knowing your story, owning your beliefs, expanding what I call constraining stories into sustaining stories. That's perhaps another talk of how we get from that narrow, thin lens or a story that's not holding our full potential to expand that, to bring it to a larger one that can hold more of who we are and what is possible. How we listen to another in their story first and understand the meaning they've made, what their goals, values, needs are. And then through that combination of both active listening and telling the message to that particular audience to get them to this place, through choosing the right story in the moment to get there. So coming back to my executive, in the 2 days that we were together sharing story, it began with him with his PowerPoint actually in his back pocket that he was planning to pull up within 3 to 5 minutes after he told his story. But he, in storytelling without the PowerPoint and the need of the clicker, actually brought his microphone around in front of the podium and started to engage and interact in sharing his story. And something not only happens when one gives a story out, but something happens between teller and listener that changes the whole dynamic. It's an organic and alive thing. And he started to feel a difference in how people were actually listening, engaged, giving their full attention, and in fact, present for him, seeing his own willingness and courage to be vulnerable in sharing part of himself. He ended up speaking for the whole hour in getting deeply into his beliefs and values as his personal mission and vision tied to the mission and vision of the organization and what his hopes are for where it's going to move. He evolved a story in that interaction he didn't even hadn't consciously, intentionally known was in him. And after that, all of the exercises that unfolded throughout the day that began of putting people cross divisions, cross silos into small groups to listen, who am I? Who are we? Who are we together in this organization? What are the underlying values that we share that bring us to a common mission around patient care for the quality and continuity of their lives? What are the competencies, and this comes back to the do, that we need to bring those values into action? And how is the diversity of our contributions make us stronger? And through the 2 days of having these storied conversations through prompts from everyone we brought into the room, everyone from someone who works in the cafeteria all the way up to the CEO, to each share why they're there and what they contribute, we began to form a larger story of who we were and created more of a collaborative, storied culture that hopefully we're going to support both the CEO and the larger organization and each individual within it to move forward into a new story using their story intelligence to get there. This is how to find me if you'd like to learn more, but I am eager to hear your questions and what got stirred up for you in hearing these thoughts.
Lani, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. And let me just share these links in the chat so we can really talk without the slide, just to be more comfortable here. Thank you so much. I loved hearing this metaphor of the driver and the listener. And you know what? While we are waiting for the questions from the chat, this is a hint, by the way. The questions, guys, we're waiting. I have this question for you. This metaphor is beautiful in terms of having the driver, or the passenger, and the destination. But what is your view on the bumpy roads and the barriers that are going there? So let me be a bit more specific. What are the key ones we need to be aware of before we begin to tell our story?
So I think as we're also the work to do before you start on the journey is you map the journey, and that's part of the emotional intelligence of what's my destination, what's my idea of how I want to get there, and what do I anticipate as the issues. And of course, you can't anticipate all of them, but the more that you are prepared and have your toolkit in place when those happen, and those involve not only a toolbox full of stories, but as Dan was beginning before, to put pauses in place when you hit those bumps, to take a step back, to relocate where you are on the map, and that's done through listening. It's about listening to self, listening to other, and where we are and what story might be helpful to help move us forward from this place on. So it might be that where the vehicle you began in breaks down, doesn't work anymore, and a new vehicle is needed to continue to carry you into that place of a vision of what that next story we're trying to reach or move into might be. So all those pieces, Artem, of that have been already conveyed today of seeing where the resistance is, that's part of where often the bumps come, and how to anticipate those and to speak to them before they arise.
Yeah, lovely. Great recap there. Thank you so much. We have several more questions coming in. Ian wants to know, how has your story shaped your journey? I know you have been telling a little bit about it today, but maybe a bit more for Ian and the audience.
So there's a piece of my journey that I didn't tell in the beginning that has shaped my journey tremendously. When I first started learning about story and story as a change agent, I was most interested in the beginning, before my work in for-profit organizations, was working in nonprofits, and especially with individuals whose voices had been marginalized or silenced, or whose stories had not been heard. So my first work in the late 90s was actually working both in prisons as well as with formerly incarcerated. And that's where I really learned a lot about story as a change agent and the emotional intelligence of how we hold ourselves in our stories. What are the places where we get stuck in our own story, where we're holding a story that's about ourselves that is smaller than our potential, and how we can grow through that. So my work and learning through that population led me into looking at leadership and change. And one of the first leadership development programs I created was in a homeless shelter, where I was invited to put together an 8-week course on storytelling and leadership for women who were actually homeless and living in this shelter. And it's about finding your voice, finding your purpose, what matters to you, and about telling your story in such a way that you can step into it in a larger way, but that it also impacts change within our culture, within our environment, change in how others perceive us, change in how others see the world. And so, story as a change agent in these areas taught me so much that allowed me then to step in with executives in organizations. At one point, somebody asked me, what's the difference of working with somebody who's homeless as opposed to a CEO of a Fortune 100? And I said, there's none. There's no difference. The story work is the same. And what we're struggling with as humans in terms of finding meaning and purpose, of being heard, seen, of feeling like we have a common mission that gives our life some sense of meaning, it's all the same work. And that's what I believe is story intelligence.
I like when people say that there is no difference between the people. There's much more to what unites us and makes us the same. Lovely. Lani, Carol has a great question here. Let me quote it. She says the metaphor is lovely, which I totally agree on. And she writes, how can we apply this kind of thinking in maybe a learning environment, such as utilizing the structure of a story you have described as a trainer? So maybe some insights on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when I'm in training situations, I often begin my storytelling workshops again with listening activities that put out a prompt that is along those lines of sort of who am I and why am I here? But I set it up so that people have to actually tell this story to multiple partners at the same time they're hearing the story from multiple partners. And two things happen in this. They're seeing how the story shifts both through multiple tellings, but also how your story shifts with multiple audiences. At the same time, you are listening to multiple variations of other people's telling their same story that you're telling. And the insights of the commonalities as well as the uniqueness begins to expand both teller and listener in this situation. So I believe that the more we are intentional in having the prompts that allow us to listen to ourselves and to each other on the deepest levels, and that we see it as not a one and done, but it's an ongoing process of expanding our understanding of self and other and what's important between us. That's how we are continually sort of growing our story. And training situations are ideal to have these kinds of wonderful opportunities for people to be listening to themselves and to each other in an organization across levels, to continually get more insight and understanding to what our story actually is. And I've been amazed at how often at the end of a day, the mission and the vision statements are very different within an organization than they were at the beginning, when it moves from being an intellectual exercise to one that's actually fully grounded in who we are and what we're actually doing and what are the values that's embedded in and what's the story not only we want to tell, but that we are living now in the work that we're doing.
Wow, thank you so much. Lovely. I anticipated some sort of an answer like, well, when you give an exercise, tell this kind of story, or when you're breaking theory, tell this kind of story. But your answer is way deeper. It's also about understanding the context between the people and the story they are living through. Thank you so much. There are a lot of more questions coming in. Let me just ask you one last one here. It's the one I saw here. So yeah, I think this one will benefit us all greatly. So top managers are often afraid of vulnerability. Is there a way to cure them? Asks Joanna.
I've become so aware of that, and with the CEO whose story I was just telling, it's starting in small parts and beginning with that initial interview of so often they want to cut to how do I do this, and I want to move fast and make things happen, but to pull it a little bit back and to say, I'd like to get to know you first. So it is that role modeling and asking those questions before we begin, of even taking me back to who were the early experiences or mentors or challengers that led you to develop the either abilities and skills or values that led you to be in this role now at this time. And they often think, I don't have time for this. But the more we can actually slow it down and do that preliminary work, the more they understand from the inside out the power of grounding yourself in your own story. And they are often then open to allowing that time and room to happen within the larger organization and to make time for that. And it's time that's so well spent because everyone is then grounded in those stories that are all the individual stories that come together to make up the larger story of who we are and what we're trying to achieve together. So it's beginning, I believe, at the top and role modeling that ask and listen that hopefully then begins to permeate down through the organization.
Lovely. Lovely. And again, starting from the top by introducing this way of being a human in the workplace.
One more quick story that came out of that case study that I shared. Our initial suggestion was that rather than having in this retreat only the top 100 executives within the organization, we asked that there be a cross-section of the organization from the bottom to the top. And the CEO was absolutely against it. He didn't have the time or the finances to support that. So what we negotiated was we came in about 3 weeks before with a video camera and permission, and we actually videotaped the prompt. What do you do here and why do you do it? Why do you continue to do it? And we did everyone from people who park cars to work in the cafeteria to clean to nurses to admins. And we had a cross section of stories across the organization that we played throughout those 2 days. There was a cafeteria worker who said, I've been in this hospital for 30 years, just checking out people with food. And the doctors, they don't know that I do as much healing here as they do, that I see the families as well as sometimes the patients who come down to get different food than they're served in their room. And I get to know their names and I get to see them day to day and how they're doing. And that I can give them a smile. I can continually check in with how their story is unfolding. She said just the other day, I noticed that an older couple who had been coming for several weeks had stopped, and then they came back through again. And I saw the look on their faces, and I said, what's happened? Because I knew that their child was in this hospital. And they said, our child died a week ago. We had to pull ourselves together, but we came back today to have lunch in the cafeteria because we needed you to know how we are and how our story ended. And she said, I hugged them deeply. And I said, come back and have lunch, please, anytime. I want to know how you are still doing. She said, that's why I'm here and why you doctors need me to be here.
Wow.
Example of the power of story and meaning making and her sense of value in this large organization that was central actually to the smooth working of that organization.
Wow. Such a deep and touching story. Thank you so much for sharing it. Lovely. What a great adage to the case, this lovely human part. Lani, thank you so much. That was really awesome. Let me share the links. And for all of you guys, please write your thank yous and your fires to Lani. I still have this final question for you, as always. I wanted to know how would you finish the phrase that starts like this. You've heard it several times today. So if the story could come alive to teach leaders one thing and one thing only, that one thing would be?
I'm always here. And the more you pay attention to me and know me and listen to me, the more I can help you.
Wow. The story is always present and the leader should always be present. That's a beautiful way to connect the two dots. Lani, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk and wonderful spending the time with you today.
Thanks, Artem. This is a magnificent thing. I'm excited to learn more from everyone else who's coming.
Oh, yes, that's what's about to happen. Thank you so much. See you in the next day.